Okay, let's dive right in. We're embarking on a deep dive today into the incredible, sometimes brutal challenges the human body faces when we leave the comfort zone of Earth's surface.
Yeah, when we venture upwards into high altitudes, the demanding world of aviation, and the truly alien frontier of spaceflight.
It really is all about pushing human physiology to its absolute limits.
Exactly. And our guide for this exploration is some really solid, expert level physiology text. It tackles these extreme environments head on.
Showing us precisely how our bodies respond, how they try to adapt.
And frankly, sometimes how they just aren't built to handle things like, critically low oxygen or crushing acceleration forces and even the bizarre absence of gravity.
So our mission in this deep dive, and this is really tailored specifically for you listening, is to cut through the complexity.
Right. We want to pull out the most crucial insights, the fundamental principles.
Yeah, the things that make you say, aha, and help you understand these physiological challenges with, well, the clarity of a professional in the field.
Think of this as your shortcut to truly mastering the science of human endurance, adaptation in these extreme settings.
It's less like reading a textbook and more like we're going through this fascinating material together.
Pointing out what's absolutely key and why it matters, whether you're, say, an aviator, a climber, or just someone profoundly curious about what happens when humans go where we weren't, initially designed to go.
Okay, so where does this whole physiological saga begin? When you decide to climb a mountain or fly in a plane, the source material starts with the most fundamental problem.
Right. The one you encounter as soon as you ascend, the decreasing barometric pressure.
That's the bedrock principle, isn't it?
Yeah.
For high altitude physiology.
It absolutely is. The entire column of air above you is pressing down, and well, the higher you go, the less air is above you, so the less pressure there is. Simple as that, fundamentally.
And the numbers really highlight this. The text points out, at sea level, that total atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeters of mercury millimeters G.
Feels like nothing to us. We're completely used to it.
But climb just to 10,000 feet, a height many mountains reach.
Yeah, pretty common altitude.
And that pressure has already dropped significantly, down to about 523 millimeter Hg.
And then go way up, say 50,000 feet maybe, the cruising altitude for a jet if it weren't pressurized.
Right, hypothetical.
And the pressure is a mere 87 millimeter Hg, a tiny fraction of sea level.
And that's the critical point, this decrease in total barometric pressure.
Is the single most basic cause of all the oxygen problems you face at high altitude. It's the starting point for everything else.
The air composition itself doesn't change much, right? Still roughly 21% oxygen.
Pretty much, yeah. But there's just less of it pressing down. So the pressure exerted by the oxygen, it's partial pressure, or PO2.
Ah, the PO2, that's the key number.
That's the key number. It decreases proportionally with the total pressure.
Okay, give us an analogy, like a crowd.
Yeah, think of it like a crowd in a room. The total pressure is how many people are pressing on you from all sides. The PO2 is how many oxygen molecules specifically are pressing on you.
So if you thin the crowd,
fewer oxygen molecules are pushing. So at sea level, 760 millimeter Hg total pressure, the atmospheric PO2 is a healthy 159 millimeter Hg.
plenty of oxygen pressure.
But at 50,000 feet, where the total pressure is just 87 millimeter Hg, the atmospheric PO2 plummets to only 18 millimeter Hg.
18. That's a monumental drop in the sheer availability of oxygen molecules to even get into your lungs.
And the situation gets even more challenging when you consider the air inside your lungs in those tiny air sacs, the alveoli.
Right, that's where the actual gas exchange of the blood happens.
Exactly. And here, the air you breathe in gets diluted. It gets mixed with two other things, water vapor and carbon dioxide.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Water vapor.
The source points out that water vapor pressure is constant in the alveoli, regardless of altitude. It stays at 47 millimeter Hg.
Why is that?
Because the air inside your lungs is always warm to body temperature and it gets saturated with water vapor from the moist surfaces of your respiratory tract. So that 47 millimeter Hg is always taking up a fixed chunk of the available pressure space in your alveoli. It doesn't change with altitude.
Okay, so 47 millimeter Hg is always subtracted from the total pressure inside the alveoli. What about CO2?
And then there's carbon dioxide. CO2 is constantly diffusing from your blood into the alveoli to be breathed out.
Standard process.
At sea level, the typical alveolar PSO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, is about 40 millimeter Hg.
But does that change with altitude?
Ah, yes. Here's a key adaptation. At very high altitudes, especially if you're acclimatized, you start to breathe much harder, significantly increased ventilation.
Makes sense, trying to get more oxygen.
Right. But a side effect is that this increased ventilation blows off more CO2, so the alveolar PSO2 actually falls.
How much can it fall?
Potentially down to about 7 millimeter Hg in someone who is very well acclimatized, much lower than the 40 at sea level.
Okay, let's put this all together. The source uses an extreme example, the summit of Mount Everest, about 29,000 feet.
Right. For an acclimatized person up there, the total barometric pressure is only around 253 millimeter Hg, very low.
So start with that 253 first, subtract the water vapor.
Okay, 253 minus the constant 47 millimeter Hg for water vapor. That leaves 206 millimeter Hg.
That's the total pressure available in the alveoli for all the other gases, mostly oxygen and nitrogen.
Right. Now for our acclimatized climber, they're breathing really heavily, so their alveolar PCO2 is super low. We said about 7 millimeter Hg.
So subtract that too, 206 minus 7.
Equals 199 millimeter Hg. This 199 is the remaining pressure space available just for oxygen and nitrogen in the alveoli.
Now, oxygen is normally about 21% or 1/5 of the air. So if it maintained that proportion within the alveoli,
Of that remaining 199 millimeter Hg, the potential alveolar PO2 would be around, what, 15th of 199?
yeah.
Roughly 40 millimeter Hg.
But that's not the final number, is it? Because the body is actively taking oxygen out of the alveoli.
Exactly. Oxygen is constantly diffusing into the blood. So the actual alveolar PO2, the pressure gradient that's actually driving oxygen into your bloodstream, is even lower. It drops to about 35 millimeter Hg at the summit for that well-acclimatized person.
35, that number really hits home.
It does. And the source drives home the stark reality. With an alveolar PO2 of only 35 millimeter Hg, only the very best acclimatized individuals can barely survive breathing ambient air at the summit of Everest.
It shows just how thin the oxygen pressure gets, right where that critical gas exchange needs to happen at the highest points on Earth.
It's right at the absolute edge of human tolerance.
And it's interesting to see the difference acclimatization makes even lower down. The source has a table, table 44.1. It shows that at 20,000 feet, an unacclimatized person has an alveolar PO2 of only about 40 millimeter Hg, which is already quite low.
Yeah, about the same as the potential pressure on Everest before absorption.
But someone who is acclimatized at that same 20,000 feet can get their alveolar PO2 up to about 53 millimeter Hg.
That 13 millimeter Hg difference is physiologically huge at those low levels. It makes a massive difference in oxygen delivery.
And that comes largely from the acclimatized person's increased ventilation, breathing harder.
Primarily, yes. Bringing more fresh, albeit low pressure, air into the alveoli more rapidly. We'll definitely need to unpack how the body achieves that sustained increase in ventilation later, because it's quite a fascinating process involving the kidneys and brain chemistry.
Okay, so ultimately, all this talk about partial pressure in the alveoli, it matters because the amount of oxygen that actually loads onto your hemoglobin in the blood
Your arterial blood oxygen saturation.
is directly determined by that alveolar PO2. There's a direct relationship.
Absolutely. And figure 44:1 in the source material shows this clearly. The blue curve represents breathing normal air.
Right. And up to around 10,000 feet, that curve shows your hemoglobin saturation stays pretty high.
Yeah, generally above 90%. Your body compensates pretty well up to that point.
But above 10,000 feet.
As that alveolar PO2 starts dropping more significantly, your hemoglobin saturation plummets rapidly. The curve gets very steep.
For example, at 20,000 feet, breathing air.
You know, your saturation is already below 70%. And when you get below 70%, maybe even below 80%, your tissues are really starting to feel it. They're suffering from lack of oxygen or hypoxia.
Okay. So that's the core problem of altitude, the low oxygen pressure, the low PO2. But what if you change the game? What if you breathe pure oxygen instead of air?
Now this is a fundamental game changer, especially in aviation, where you often have oxygen systems available.
How does it work?
Well, think about it. Air is mostly nitrogen, about 79%. When you breathe pure O2, you're essentially flushing out almost all that nitrogen from your lungs.
And replacing it with oxygen.
Exactly. This dramatically boosts the oxygen partial pressure in the alveoli, even if the total pressure outside is low.
And the source gives a powerful illustration of this. At 30,000 feet, breathing air, we saw the alveolar PO2 is only about 18 millimeter Hg.
Dangerously low.
But breathe pure oxygen at that same 30,000 feet, and that alveolar PO2 can skyrocket to 139 millimeter Hg.
Wow, 139, that's a massive increase. That fundamentally changes the amount of oxygen available to your blood. It completely changes the driving pressure for oxygen getting into the blood. This translates directly to much better hemoglobin saturation.
And that's shown by the red curve in that same figure 44:1.
Precisely. Breathing pure oxygen allows your arterial saturation to stay high, above 90% at much higher altitudes. All the way up to about 39,000 feet, you can maintain good saturation.
But wait, even with pure O2, that red curve still drops sharply above 39,000 feet, doesn't it?
It does. By 47,000 feet, even breathing pure oxygen, your saturation is down to around 50%.
So pure oxygen buys you significant altitude capability, maybe an extra 29,000 feet of good saturation.
But it doesn't make you immune to hypoxia forever. There's still a limit imposed by the falling total barometric pressure. Eventually, even 100% oxygen isn't enough if the total pressure is too low.
This concept is crucial then for understanding the ceiling for aircraft, especially unpressurized ones.
Yes, the source defines a practical limit, especially for short exposure times, based on arterial oxygen saturation. The threshold they use is about 50% saturation.
Why 50?
A low 50% saturation, you typically lose consciousness fairly quickly. So it's a critical threshold for functional survival.
Okay. So breathing regular air, at what altitude do you hit that critical 50% saturation level?
According to the data, that's reached at roughly 23,000 feet.
So 23,000 feet is the approximate physiological ceiling for an unpressurized aircraft without supplementary oxygen.
Correct. Go much above that breathing air, and you're likely to pass out relatively quickly.
But if you're breathing pure oxygen,
Yeah.
you can ascend much higher before hitting that same 50% saturation level. That threshold isn't reached until about 47,000 feet, assuming your oxygen delivery system is working perfectly, of course.
So pure O2 effectively doubles your practical physiological ceiling in this scenario, from 23,000 to 47,000 feet.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
It makes flight at much higher altitudes possible without needing a fully pressurized cabin, at least for, limited periods. Okay, so we understand the low oxygen problem and how breathing pure oxygen helps dramatically. But what happens to your body right away when the oxygen pressure starts to drop, before any long-term adaptations can kick in? What are those immediate consequences?
These are the acute effects of hypoxia, the immediate hit. For an unacclimatized person breathing air, they typically start to become noticeable at altitudes as low as, say, 12,000 feet.
And what are those early symptoms like?
They're often subtle at first, which makes them insidious. A feeling of drowsiness or maybe lassitude, that's a lack of energy, a general weariness. You might feel mentally and muscularly fatigued.
Like you just didn't sleep well.
Kind of like that, yeah. A headache is very common. Sometimes nausea can occur.
And then there's the really dangerous one.
Yes, euphoria. A deceptive feeling of intense well-being or lightheadedness. It feels pleasant, maybe even a bit giddy.
But it completely masks the danger.
Exactly. It masks the fact that your brain isn't getting enough oxygen. Someone feeling euphoric might think they're doing great, making brilliant decisions.
When actually their judgment is severely impaired.
Precisely. And as you go higher, the symptoms escalate rapidly and become much less subtle.
What happens above, say, 18,000 feet?
Above 18,000 feet, you can start experiencing involuntary muscle twitching or even progress to seizures.
And higher still, like that 23,000-foot ceiling we talked about for air breathing.
Above 23,000 feet, for someone who isn't acclimatized, the outcome is swift and severe. Coma, often followed by death, potentially within minutes. The brain simply cannot function.
One of the most critical impairments, especially for anyone performing complex tasks like flying or climbing, even at lower altitudes like 15,000 feet, is that decrease in mental proficiency.
This is often the first truly dangerous effect, even before the more dramatic physical symptoms. Hypoxia seriously degrades your judgment, your memory, and your fine motor control, the ability to do precise, coordinated movements.
Like adjusting controls or tying a knot.
Exactly, and the source gives a really chilling statistic on this. An unacclimatized aviator at 15,000 feet for just 1 hour can see their mental capacity reduced by about half. 50% reduction.
Just 1 hour at 15,000 feet.
And if they stay there for 18 hours, it plummets to only about 20% of their normal cognitive function.
20%. Imagine trying to fly a plane or make critical life or death decisions with only 20% of your normal brain power.
It's a recipe for disaster. It really highlights why oxygen discipline and altitude awareness are so critical in aviation and mountaineering.
So that's the immediate danger, acute hypoxia.
Yeah.
But the human body is, well, an incredible machine. It's built for adaptation.
It really is.
If you stay at high altitude, not just for minutes or hours, but for days, weeks, or even years, your body undergoes profound changes. It increases its tolerance to that low oxygen pressure. This is acclimatization.
Right. Acclimatization is the process that allows people to live and function much better at altitude than they initially could. It lets them work harder, hike higher, and generally suffer far fewer of those negative hypoxic effects we just described.
How does the body do it? The source outlines 5 principal ways, 5 main mechanisms of this adaptation.
Yeah, there are 5 key areas where the body adjusts. First, a significant increase in pulmonary ventilation, basically, breathing more air, deeper and faster. Second, an increased number of red blood cells to carry more oxygen.
Third, an increased diffusing capacity of the lungs, getting oxygen across that lung membrane into the blood more efficiently.
Fourth is increased vascularity of the peripheral tissues, basically growing more blood vessels, more capillaries out in the body's tissues.
And fifth,
And fifth, an increased ability of the tissue cells themselves to utilize oxygen even when the CO2 is low. Cellular level changes.
okay, 5 big mechanisms. They must work together.
Absolutely. They work in concert to improve both the delivery of oxygen to the tissues and the tissue's ability to actually use that oxygen effectively, even when it's scarce.
Let's break these down, starting with that crucial increase in breathing, the ventilation.
Okay, the source explains there's actually a two-phase response here.
An immediate one and a slower one.
Exactly. The moment you're exposed to low PO2, it triggers sensors in your arteries called arterial chemoreceptors. These immediately stimulate increased breathing or alveolar ventilation.
How much?
Up to about 1.65 times normal within seconds. It's your body's initial quick fix attempt to get more oxygen in.
But that's not the big increase, is it?
No, the larger, more sustained increase happens over several days. If you stay at high altitude, your ventilation continues to climb, eventually reaching levels up to about 5 times normal.
5 times. That's a huge increase in air turnover.
It is. This pumps a much larger volume of air through your lungs continuously, helping to compensate for the low oxygen pressure in each breath.
Now, here's a fascinating detail the source highlights about this process. There's apparently a temporary braking effect on this increase in breathing.
Yes, this is really interesting physiology. When you first start breathing harder, that immediate response.
The 1.65 times increase.
Right. You blow off a lot more carbon dioxide than usual. This lowers the peak O2 in your blood, which makes your body fluids more alkaline, a state called respiratory alkalosis.
Okay, low CO2, high pH.
And these changes, the lower CO2 and higher pH, actually inhibit the main respiratory control center located in your brainstem.
So wait, the low oxygen sensors are saying breathe more, but the brainstem center is sensitive to CO2 and pH and is saying, whoa, slow down, CO2 is low.
That's essentially it. You get these conflicting signals. The drive from low O2 via the peripheral chemoreceptors is partially counteracted by the inhibition at the brainstem respiratory center due to low CO2 high pH. This limits how much your breathing can increase initially.
But you said this braking effect fades.
It does. The source says this inhibition fades over the course of about 2 to 5 days.
Now, what changes?
The reason for this fading inhibition is believed to be a gradual reduction in bicarbonate ions, HCO3, in the fluids surrounding the brain and spinal cord, the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, and also within the brain tissues themselves.
Bicarbonate acts as a buffer, right? So less bicarbonate.
It means the pH in the immediate environment of those respiratory center neurons starts to creep back down slightly, getting closer to normal, even though the rest of the blood might still be a bit alkaline.
Ah, so this local change in the brain removes the inhibitory signal.
Precisely. It makes the respiratory center less sensitive to the low CO2 and more responsive to the persistent breathe more signal coming from the peripheral chemoreceptors that are still detecting low oxygen.
And our kidneys get involved in this too.
Yes, the kidneys play a critical role in this chemical adjustment over those few days. They help compensate for the overall respiratory alkalosis
How do they do that?
by adjusting how they handle hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. They reduce the secretion of hydrogen ions into the urine and increase the excretion of bicarbonate ions out of the body in the urine.
So the kidneys are actively getting rid of the base buffer, the bicarbonate.
Exactly. This metabolic compensation by the kidneys gradually lowers the bicarbonate levels in your plasma and, consequently, in the CSF. This helps bring the pH back towards normal around the respiratory centers, effectively removing that initial break and allowing ventilation to increase dramatically up to that 5 times normal level, driven now much more strongly by the hypoxia.
That is a beautiful example of multiple physiological systems, respiratory, chemical buffers, kidneys, nervous system working together over time to adapt really intricate.
It really is. Okay, the second key mechanism of acclimatization, increasing your red blood cell production.
Getting more oxygen carriers.
Right. Hypoxia itself is a very powerful stimulus for your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. This process is primarily driven by a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO.
EPO, you hear about that with athletes sometimes.
You do. It's released mainly by the kidneys when they sense low oxygen levels. EPO then travels to the bone marrow and tells it to ramp up red blood cell production.
And this takes time, right? Not instant like the breathing change.
Correct. This happens over several weeks at high altitude. Your body goes into overdrive producing red cells. The source states that your hematocrit.
That's the percentage of blood volume that is red cells.
Yes. It can increase from a normal 40-45% up to an average of about 60%. Some individuals go even higher.
60%, that's a much thicker blood.
It is. And your whole blood hemoglobin concentration, hemoglobin being the actual molecule within the red cells that binds oxygen, also rises significantly, from maybe 15 grams per deciliter of blood up to around 20 grams per deciliter.
So more concentrated red cells and more hemoglobin in each drop of blood.
And there's more. On top of that concentration increase, your overall blood volume often increases as well, maybe by 20% to 30%.
More blood overall.
Yes. So the combined effect of having a higher blood volume and an increased hemoglobin concentration within that blood means your total body hemoglobin, the total amount of oxygen-carrying protein in your entire circulation, can increase by 50% or even more.
That's a huge boost in oxygen carrying capacity.
Right.
Like adding a whole fleet of extra oxygen carrying trucks to your circulatory highway.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, mechanism number 3. Increasing the diffusing capacity of the lungs.
This sounds like making the transfer of oxygen from the air sacs into the blood more efficient.
Exactly. Diffusing capacity refers to how effectively oxygen can move from the alveoli across that very thin alveolar capillary membrane and into the blood plasma and red blood cells.
How is it measured?
It's typically measured in milliliters of oxygen transferred per minute for every millimeter of mercury pressure difference that's driving the oxygen across the membrane. At sea level, the normal resting value is around 21 mmHg.
And at high altitude, this capacity increases.
Significantly. The source says it can increase by as much as threefold compared to sea level values, especially during exercise at altitude.
Wow, threefold. How does the lung manage that? What changes?
Several factors contribute. One is an increase in the pulmonary capillary blood volume. Basically, the tiny capillaries surrounding the alveoli become more engorged with blood. This stretches them out and increases the surface area of blood exposed to the alveolar air.
More contact area for oxygen to cross.
Right. Another factor is an increase in the total volume of air in your lungs. Simply having larger lung volumes at full inflation expands the total surface area of that alveolar capillary membrane itself. Again, more area for diffusion.
Makes sense.
And finally, there's often an increase in pulmonary arterial blood pressure at high altitude. We'll talk more about the downsides of this later, but one potential benefit initially is that this higher pressure helps force blood into more of the tiny alveolar capillaries than usual.
Especially ones that aren't normally used much.
Exactly, particularly in the upper parts of the lungs, which aren't as well perfused with blood when you're just sitting or standing quietly at sea level.
Yeah.
By recruiting these extra capillaries, you further increase the total surface area available for gas exchange.
Okay, so better ventilation, more red cells, and more efficient lungs. What about the rest of the body's circulation? The peripheral tissues.
Right, the fourth mechanism involves changes there. The source notes something interesting about cardiac output, the volume of blood pumped by your heart per minute. Immediately upon ascending to high altitude, your cardiac output often increases significantly, maybe by as much as 30%.
Pumping faster to deliver oxygen.
Initially, yes. However, this increased cardiac output usually returns back towards normal levels over several weeks as acclimatization progresses.
Why does it go back down?
It's linked to that increase in red blood cells we just talked about. As your hematocrit rises and your blood's oxygen-carrying capacity improves dramatically.
Your body doesn't need to pump as much volume of blood per minute to deliver the same amount of oxygen to the tissues. Each unit of blood is carrying more O2.
Exactly. The system becomes more efficient, so the heart rate and stroke volume can decrease back towards baseline, but there's a more structural long-term adaptation in the peripheral tissues.
Which is
angiogenesis. This is the actual growth of entirely new capillaries, those tiny blood vessels within the tissues throughout your body, muscles, organs, everywhere.
the body grows more pipes.
Essentially, yes, more tiny pipes.
Huh.
This is critically important because having more capillaries interwoven among the tissue cells means the average distance that oxygen has to diffuse from the blood into the cell is shortened.
Making delivery more direct and efficient, especially when oxygen levels are low.
Precisely. The source observes that this effect seems to be more pronounced in animals that are born and raised at high altitudes compared to lowlanders who move there later in life. This suggests there might be a developmental window where this process is most active.
Where is this angiogenesis most noticeable?
It's particularly evident in tissues that are very metabolically active or experience significant chronic hypoxia. The text gives the example of the muscle tissue of the right ventricle of the heart.
Why the right ventricle specifically?
Because at high altitude, it faces a double whammy. The general systemic hypoxia and a greatly increased workload because it has to pump blood against the high pressure in the pulmonary circulation we mentioned earlier, pulmonary hypertension. This combined stress strongly stimulates capillary growth within the right ventricular muscle itself.
Fascinating. Okay, that brings us to the fifth point of acclimatization.
Yeah.
Changes within the tissue cells themselves. Cellular acclimatization.
Right. This is about adaptations happening right inside the cells, improving how they function with less oxygen available.
Is this well understood?
It's perhaps harder to quantify precisely in humans compared to, say, measuring red blood cells. But observations in high-altitude native animals show they tend to have slightly more mitochondria.
Mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, where oxygen is used to make energy.
Exactly. More mitochondria and also higher concentrations of cellular oxidative enzyme systems, the molecular machinery within the mitochondria that uses oxygen.
So the cells become better equipped for aerobic metabolism.
That's the idea. The presumption, as the source puts it, is that acclimatized humans also develop an enhanced ability for their tissue cells to utilize oxygen more effectively, extracting more energy from each oxygen molecule, even when the oxygen pressure delivered to the cells is significantly lower than at sea level.
So improved delivery and improved utilization at the cell level.
Correct. Now, bringing many of these diverse adaptations together at a molecular level is something the source describes as the body's master switch for responding to hypoxia.
Ah, yes, you mentioned these earlier, hypoxia-inducible factors, or HIFs.
HIFs. They are truly fundamental to this whole process. They are a type of protein called transcription factors.
Meaning they control which genes get turned on or off.
Exactly. They can bind to specific sequences on DNA and regulate gene activity. Their specific job is to sense low oxygen levels within the cell and, in response, activate a whole suite of genes that produce proteins necessary for the body to survive and function under hypoxic conditions.
Genes involved in oxygen delivery and energy use.
Precisely. Genes governing things like getting more oxygen delivered and helping cells handle energy production when oxygen is scarce.
And the source said these are incredibly widespread in nature.
Yes, it's remarkable. HIFs are found in nearly all oxygen-breathing species, from simple worms all the way up to us humans. It seems to be a very ancient, conserved biological mechanism evolved specifically to cope with low oxygen environments.
What specific genes or pathways do these HIFs control? The source listed some key ones.
Yeah, HIF1, which is a major player, directly controls several critical genes. For instance, genes for vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF.
VEGF sounds familiar.
It's a major driver of angiogenesis, the growth of new blood vessels. So HIF activation directly explains that increased tissue capillarity we talked about as the fourth mechanism.
Makes sense. What else?
HIFs also activate the genes for erythropoietin, EPO.
The hormone that boosts red blood cell production.
Right, so HIFs directly explain the polycythemia, the increased red blood cell count seen at altitude, which was our second mechanism.
Okay, connecting the dots here.
They also regulate genes related to mitochondria and those cellular oxidative enzymes supporting the cellular adaptations, the fifth mechanism, and genes for glycolytic enzymes.
Glycolysis. That's making energy without oxygen, or anaerobic metabolism.
Exactly. Enhancing anaerobic metabolism allows cells to produce at least some energy more effectively when oxygen is limited. And interestingly, the source also mentions HIFs controlling genes that increase the availability of nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide, what does that do here?
Nitric oxide can cause vasodilation, a widening of blood vessels. In the lungs, this can be a beneficial local effect, helping to improve blood flow in well-ventilated areas. Although, as we'll discuss later, widespread vasoconstriction in the lungs due to chronic hypoxia is actually a major problem in disease states, so the nitric oxide role is complex.
Okay, so how do these HIFs actually sense the oxygen level? How does the switch work?
It's quite elegant, really. Under normal oxygen-rich conditions, there are specific enzymes called HIF hydroxylases. These enzymes need oxygen to function. When oxygen is plentiful, these hydroxylases attach a little chemical tag, a hydroxyl group, to the HIF subunits. This tag marks the HIF protein for rapid destruction by the cell's disposal machinery. So HIF levels stay low.
But when oxygen levels drop,
Those HIF hydroxylases become inactive because they don't have enough oxygen substrate. Without the hydroxyl tag being added, the HIF subunits are no longer targeted for destruction. They start to build up in the cell.
and then they become active.
They accumulate, form an active complex, and this active HIF complex can then move into the cell's nucleus, bind to specific DNA sequences called hypoxia response elements, and effectively turn on all those beneficial hypoxia response genes we just listed, VEGF, EPO, etc.
So HIFs really are a molecular master switch. They sense the oxygen level and then orchestrate a whole coordinated genetic program to help the body cope.
Absolutely. Understanding HIFs is really key to understanding the fundamental biology of how our bodies respond and adapt to low oxygen environments. It ties many of the physiological changes together at the genetic level.
Now, while lowlanders like us can acclimatize significantly over time if we stay at altitude,
And some people acclimatize much better than others.
the source highlights that people who've lived at high altitudes for many generations, like populations in the Andes and the Himalayas, they represent the absolute pinnacle of natural adaptation to hypoxia.
They really do. The text mentions populations in the Peruvian Andes who live permanently at astonishing altitudes, like 17,500 feet.
17,500 feet. That's higher than most mountains outside the major ranges.
And they even work in mines located at 19,000 feet. And the source is quite clear on this point. These native highlanders are physiologically superior in every aspect of acclimatization compared to even the best acclimatized lowlanders.
Even if a lowlander lives there for, say, 10 years or more.
Even then, the generational adaptation confers advantages that long-term acclimatization alone seemingly cannot fully replicate.
And their adaptation starts very early.
From infancy, yes. Their bodies develop under hypoxic conditions from the very beginning. The source notes some specific physical characteristics that are common in these populations.
Like what?
They often have a greatly increased chest size, which corresponds to larger lung volumes relative to their body size.
More lung capacity.
Right. They also tend to have a somewhat decreased overall body size. The combination gives them a high ratio of ventilatory capacity to their body mass, essentially. More breathing apparatus per pound of body weight compared to lowlanders.
Makes them efficient breathing machines.
In a way, yes. Their hearts are also noted to be considerably larger than the hearts of lowlanders.
Why larger hearts?
This is likely an adaptation from pumping blood against higher pulmonary pressures and possibly delivering increased cardiac output right from birth, developing differently under chronic hypoxic stimulus.
And their ability to actually deliver oxygen to their tissues must be incredibly efficient.
It's remarkable. The source refers to figure 44.2, which shows oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves comparing high-altitude natives and sea level residents.
What do those curves show?
They show that even though the arterial PO2 in the high-altitude natives is quite low, the example given is around 40 millimeter Hg compared to maybe 95 millimeter Hg for someone at sea level.
40 is very low.
It is. But despite that low starting pressure, their blood can actually carry more total oxygen than lowlanders' blood.
How is that possible?
Because they have a much higher quantity of hemoglobin overall due to that significantly increased red blood cell mass we talked about earlier. More hemoglobin means more binding sites for oxygen, even if the pressure pushing oxygen on is lower.
So they load up more oxygen despite the low pressure.
And what's truly striking is how much of that oxygen they efficiently extract from the blood once it reaches their tissues. The source points out that their venous PO2,
The oxygen pressure in the blood returning from the tissues after the oxygen has been dropped off.
yes, their venous PO2 is only about 15 millimeter Hg less than the venous PO2 of lowlander.
Wait, let me get this straight. They start with an arterial PO2 that's maybe 55 millimeter Hg lower than a lowlander, 40 versus 95. But their venous PO2 is only 15 millimeter Hg lower.
Exactly. This means they must be extracting oxygen from their blood incredibly effectively as it passes through their tissues. The pressure drop from artery to vein is much larger for them, indicating exceedingly efficient oxygen transport and utilization right where it's needed. Their entire system is profoundly optimized for living and working in that low oxygen environment.
It's a stunning example of human adaptation over generation.
It really is. But even with all this incredible adaptation, there's still an undeniable cost to living and working at high altitude, especially when it comes to intense physical exertion. The source discusses a reduced work capacity.
Even for the natives.
Yes. Although the reduction is much less than for unacclimatized or even acclimatized lowlanders, hypoxia fundamentally decreases the maximum work rate that all muscles, both your heart muscle and your skeletal muscles, can achieve.
Why is that?
The reduction in work capacity is generally proportional to how much the body's maximum rate of oxygen uptake, the VO2 max, is decreased. If you simply cannot get as much oxygen into your body and deliver it to the working muscles per minute, you cannot sustain as high a level of work. Energy production becomes limited.
The source uses table 44-2 to quantify this, showing work capacity as a percentage of normal sea level capacity, specifically looking at an altitude of 17,000 feet.
Right. And the differences are stark. An unacclimatized person suddenly transported to 17,000 feet can only manage about 50% of their normal sea level work output. They're severely limited.
What about someone who is acclimatized for a while?
Someone who is acclimatized for 2 months at that altitude improves significantly, reaching about 68% of their sea level work capacity. Better, but still substantially reduced.
And the native Highlander. The example given is someone living at 13,200 feet, but working up at 17,000 feet.
Look at their number, 87% of a lowlander's sea level capacity. It's remarkable.
Almost normal work capacity despite the extreme altitude.
Exactly. The source emphasizes this key takeaway. Naturally acclimatized natives can sustain a daily work output that is almost equivalent to what a lowlander can achieve at sea level. Even very well acclimatized lowlanders rarely, if ever, reach this peak level of physical performance at altitude. It's a clear, quantifiable demonstration of the power and superiority of multi-generational adaptation.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about gradual adaptation, acclimatization, but what about the opposite? Going up too fast? This brings us to the dangers of rapid ascent and acute mountain sickness.
Yes, AMS. This is a serious risk for a small but significant percentage of people who ascend quickly, especially to moderate or high altitudes, without giving their bodies time to start acclimatizing.
And it can be dangerous.
It can be potentially lethal if it's not recognized and treated promptly. Treatment usually involves providing supplementary oxygen or, crucially, getting the person down to a lower altitude as quickly as possible.
When do symptoms typically appear?
Usually a few hours, up to maybe about 2 days after arriving at the higher altitude.
And the source highlights two particularly dangerous and frequent events associated with severe acute mountain sickness. They both involve edema, right? Swelling.
That's right. Acute cerebral edema, which is swelling of the brain tissue, and acute pulmonary edema, which is fluid accumulating in the air sacs of the lungs.
Let's take cerebral edema first. What causes the brain to swell?
The current leading hypothesis is that it's caused by local vasodilation, a widening of the blood vessels within the brain. This vasodilation is triggered by the low oxygen levels, the hypoxia.
Why does vasodilation cause swelling?
The dilation increases blood flow into the brain's capillaries. This, in turn, raises the pressure inside those tiny capillaries, forcing fluid to leak out of the capillaries and into the surrounding brain tissue, causing it to swell.
Like overpressurizing tiny pipes until they leak.
A bit like that, yeah. The source also suggests that certain chemical factors might play a role by making the capillaries leakier. Things like vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, which we mentioned earlier with angiogenesis.
Yeah. And inflammatory cytokines. These might increase the permeability of the endothelial cells, the cells lining the blood vessel walls.
Exactly, making them less tightly sealed, allowing more fluid to escape. And this brain swelling, the edema, is what causes the severe symptoms. Disorientation, confusion, difficulty thinking, loss of coordination, ataxia, and other significant cerebral dysfunctions. It's a neurological emergency.
Okay, what about the other one? Acute pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. What's the cause there?
Its exact cause is still debated and likely complex, but a strongly postulated mechanism involves severe and, crucially, uneven constriction of the pulmonary arterioles.
Arterioles, the small arteries leading into the lung capillaries,
Yeah.
so they constrict because of hypoxia?
Yes, normally hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, HPV, is a helpful reflex. It constricts vessels going to poorly ventilated areas of the lung, shunting blood towards better ventilated areas to optimize oxygen uptake.
But at high altitude, all areas are poorly ventilated, right? All alveoli are hypoxic.
Precisely. So you get widespread hypoxic vasoconstriction. But the key here might be that this constriction happens unevenly. Some arterioles constrict much more severely than others.
What happens then?
If some vessels clamp down hard, the blood flow gets forcefully diverted through the fewer vessels that haven't constricted as much, or maybe can't constrict as much.
So those few open vessels get slammed with high pressure and flow.
Exactly. This creates localized areas of very high capillary pressure in those non-constricted or less constricted regions. And just like in the brain, this high pressure forces fluid out of the capillaries and into the air sacs, the alveoli, causing local edema.
And it can spread.
Yes. As more areas become affected, the edema spreads through the lungs, severely impairing oxygen exchange because the alveoli are filling with fluid instead of air. This leads to dangerous pulmonary dysfunction, shortness of breath even at rest, coughing up frothy sputum, and it can rapidly become lethal.
Is there effective treatment?
The good news here is that administering supplementary oxygen usually reverses this specific type of high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, fairly quickly, often within hours, by relieving the hypoxic vasoconstriction. And again, the source mentions the possibility that increased capillary permeability, perhaps mediated by VEGF and cytokines, might contribute to the fluid leak in the lungs as well.
So going up too fast is clearly dangerous, AMS, HCECE. But interestingly, staying at very high altitude for too long can also lead to a different set of problems, a condition known as chronic mountain sickness.
Yes, CMS, sometimes called Monge's disease after the physician who first described it in the Andes. This is something that occasionally affects people, including sometimes natives who have lived at extremely high altitudes for prolonged periods, often many years or decades. It's like the body's adaptation goes too far or becomes maladaptive.
What happens in chronic mountain sickness? The source outlines a sequence of effects.
Yeah, it's a progressive decline. First, the red blood cell mass and hematocrit, which initially increase beneficially during acclimatization, become exceptionally high, often well above 65% or even 70%, way beyond the point of being helpful.
We'll get to why that's bad in a moment.
Yeah.
What's the second effect?
Second, the pulmonary arterial pressure becomes even more elevated than the already increased pressure seen during normal acclimatization. The pulmonary hypertension gets much worse.
Which puts a huge strain on the heart.
Exactly. Third, the right side of the heart, the right ventricle, which has to pump blood against this excessively high pressure in the lungs, becomes greatly enlarged, hypertrophied, and eventually starts to fail. Right-sided heart failure.
What happens next?
Fourth, perhaps surprisingly, the peripheral arterial pressure, the blood pressure in the rest of the body, often starts to fall. Fifth, this whole progression leads to full-blown congestive heart failure with fluid backup and poor circulation.
And sadly, the sixth point
is that death often follows unless the person moves permanently to a lower altitude.
A very serious condition. What are the underlying causes? Why does the body go down this path? The source postulates three main reasons.
The first goes back to that excessive red blood cell mass. Remember how hematocrit gets super high?
Yeah, over 65–70%.
When the blood becomes that packed with red cells, it gets extremely thick and viscous, like trying to pump molasses instead of water. This dramatically increases the resistance to blood flow throughout the body.
So even though there's more oxygen carrying capacity per unit of blood,
the flow itself decreases significantly because it's so hard to pump the thick blood through the vessel. So ultimately, less oxygen might actually be delivered to the tissues despite having more hemoglobin. The adaptation becomes completely counterproductive and detrimental to oxygen delivery.
That makes sense. What's the second postulated cause?
The second is that worsening widespread pulmonary arterial vasoconstriction. We discussed how hypoxia causes pulmonary vessels to constrict, HPV. In CMS, this process seems to become exaggerated or unregulated.
So even worse constriction than in normal acclimatization.
Apparently so. At very high altitude, all lung areas are hypoxic, leading to widespread constriction. In CMS, this becomes severe and sustained, leading to excessively high damaging pressures in the pulmonary arteries. This chronic, severe pulmonary hypertension is what directly causes the failure of the right side of the heart.
Okay, and the third factor?
The third contributing factor is thought to be an increase in pulmonary shunt blood flow.
Shunt, meaning blood bypasses the normal gas exchange areas.
Exactly. The intense spasm or constriction of the pulmonary arterioles is thought to force a larger proportion of the blood flow through alternative pathways in the lungs, vessels that don't go past the alveoli where gas exchange normally happens. This shunted blood bypasses the opportunity to pick up oxygen.
So it returns to the systemic circulation, still poorly oxygenated.
Precisely. This mixes with the oxygenated blood, lowering the overall arterial oxygen saturation and further compounding the tissue hypoxia problem. It makes the whole situation worse.
It sounds like a downward spiral. Is there any way back?
The encouraging aspect is that for most people afflicted with chronic mountain sickness, simply moving to a lower altitude allows their body to gradually reverse these pathological changes. The red cell count comes down, the pulmonary pressure decreases, the heart strain lessens. They usually recover significantly within days or weeks after descent.
Fascinating how the environment drives these profound and sometimes dangerous physiological shifts.
Absolutely. Okay, so that covers the complex world of altitude and low oxygen. But aviation, and especially spaceflight, introduce another major set of physiological challenges, ones that have less to do with air pressure and more to do with motion. Specifically, the effects of acceleratory forces.
Right, acceleration isn't just speeding up, it's any change in velocity or direction.
Correct. In a plane, you obviously experience linear acceleration during takeoff and landing, but you also experience significant centrifugal acceleration during turns, dives, and pullouts.
Centrifugal acceleration, that's the force that pushes you outwards when you're moving in a circle, or into your seat during a maneuver.
Exactly. It's the force experienced by a body moving along a curved path directed away from the center of curvature. The source gives the physics formula, which is quite revealing. F equals mv var r.
Okay, break that down. F is the force.
M is the mass of the object, the pilot or astronaut. V is the velocity, the speed. And R is the radius of the turn or curve.
So the force is proportional to mass. That makes sense. But look at the velocity term v squared.
That's the crucial part. The force increases with the square of the velocity. So if you double your speed in a turn, the centrifugal force doesn't just double, it quadruples.
Wow, and it's inversely proportional to the radius r.
Right, which means a sharper turn, a smaller radius, creates a much larger force, even at the same speed. These relationships are fundamental to understanding flight dynamics and their physiological impact.
How are these forces typically measured in aviation and space?
They're measured in multiples of the normal force of gravity, which we call g. So plus 1g is just the normal pull of gravity you feel sitting here right now, your body weight pressing down into the chair.
Okay, plus 1g is baseline.
If you're in a maneuver, like pulling out of a dive, and the force pressing you down into your seat is 5 times your normal weight, that's described as plus 5g. Positive g pushes you downwards relative to the aircraft.
And negative g.
Negative g is the opposite sensation, the force pulling you up out of your seat, straining against your seatbelt or harness. If that upward force equals your body weight, it's negative 1g. You'd feel momentarily weightless, then pushed upwards. This happens in maneuvers like an outside loop or pushing the nose down sharply.
Let's focus on positive g first, being pushed down into the seat. What are the main physiological effects?
The primary impact of positive G is on the circulatory system. Why? Because blood is a fluid, and it's mobile within the vessels. It's easily displaced by these strong acceleratory forces.
So where does the blood go under positive G?
It gets centrifuged, meaning it's effectively thrown or pushed towards the lowermost part of the body relative to the force vector. In a typical sitting or standing position in an aircraft pulling positive G, that means blood is forced downwards into the feet, legs, and lower abdomen.
And this causes pressure changes.
Dramatic ones. The source gives examples. At plus 5G while standing, the pressure in the veins in your feet could theoretically reach a staggering 450 millimeter HGH. Even sitting at plus 5G, it's estimated around 300 millimeter of Hg in the lower body veins.
What does that high pressure do?
It causes the veins and other capacitance vessels in the lower body to dilate significantly, and a major portion of your total blood volume pools down there. It gets stuck in your legs and abdomen.
If blood pools in the lower body,
Then much less blood is returning to your heart through the veins. If less blood returns to the heart, venous return, the heart simply cannot pump out as much blood per beat, stroke volume. The cardiac output drops dramatically.
and that affects blood pressure where?
Critically, it affects blood pressure in the upper body, especially the head and eyes. Figure 44-3 in the source illustrates this clearly. It shows what happens to arterial pressure in the upper body with a sudden exposure to plus 3.3 G in a sitting person.
What does it show?
Both the systolic, peak, and diastolic resting pressures in the arteries of the upper body initially plummet to dangerously low levels. The graph shows them falling below 22 millimeter Hg within seconds. That's barely enough pressure to perfuse the brain.
Does the body try to compensate?
Yes, your body's baroreceptor reflexes kick in almost immediately. These are pressure sensors in your major arteries, like the aorta and carotids. They detect the drastic drop in pressure and trigger a reflex response.
Like increasing heart rate and constricting blood vessels.
Exactly. They try desperately to raise the pressure back up. You can see a partial recovery in figure 44-3 after a few seconds. The pressure comes up somewhat, but it remains quite low. The example shows it stabilizing around maybe 55 millimeter Hg systolic and 20 millimeter Hg diastolic after 10-15 seconds, still well below normal.
And what happens at even higher G forces, say above 4 to 6 G?
At those levels, the pressure drop in the upper body becomes so severe that blood flow to the brain and, crucially, the retinas of the eyes is critically reduced, leading to blackout. Pilots describe it as tunnel vision rapidly closing in, followed by complete loss of vision, all within a matter of seconds.
Vision goes first.
Often, yes, because the pressure inside the eye requires a certain arterial pressure to maintain retinal perfusion. If the blackout persists because the high G continues.
Unconsciousness follows shortly after. And sustained high positive G without protection can obviously be lethal due to complete lack of blood flow to the brain.
Absolutely. Beyond the immediate circulatory effects, the source also notes another danger at extremely high positive G forces, even if they're very brief.
What's that?
The sheer mechanical force can be strong enough to fracture vertebrae, particularly in the spine. The text estimates that the average sitting person can typically withstand about 20 G before vertebral fracture becomes a significant risk.
20 G. That's immense force. Okay, what about the other direction? Negative G, feeling pulled up against the seatbelt. How does the body handle that?
The acute effects of negative G are generally less immediately dramatic than positive G in terms of causing rapid unconsciousness. However, they can potentially cause more long-term or permanent damage if severe or sustained.
What kind of tolerance levels are we talking about?
Experienced aviators can often tolerate brief exposures to -4 or -5 G without permanent harm, but it's definitely uncomfortable. It leads to intense hyperbatemia, an excessive amount of blood rushing violently to the head.
Like sitting on your head, but much more intense.
What's more intense? Yeah, you get that feeling of fullness, pressure, your face flushes red. The source mentions that this rush of blood to the head can sometimes cause momentary psychotic disturbances, lasting maybe 15-20 minutes after the exposure.
Why would that happen?
It's likely due to transient swelling in the brain tissue, a mild form of cerebral edema caused by the sudden increase in vascular pressure in the head.
What about really extreme negative G? Like negative to 20 G, is that survivable?
That's getting into highly dangerous territory. At those levels, the centrifugation of blood to the head can increase the pressure inside the cerebral blood vessels dramatically, potentially reaching 300 to 400 millimeter Hg.
Wouldn't that rupture the blood vessels in the brain? That sounds incredibly high.
You might expect that, but the source explains a fascinating protective mechanism that helps mitigate this risk, at least to some extent.
What is it?
Remember the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, that surrounds and cushions the brain and spinal cord? Under negative G, the CSF is also centrifuged towards the head, along with the blood. This increases the CSF pressure outside the brain and its blood vessels.
So the external fluid pressure rises along with the internal blood pressure.
Exactly. This increased external CSF pressure acts as a cushioning counterpressure, helping to support the vessel walls and preventing the intracerebral blood vessels, the ones inside the brain tissue, from simply bursting under the extreme internal pressure. It's a natural hydraulic buffer.
Incredible. But is everything protected?
No. The source specifically points out that your eyes are not protected by the bony cranium and this CSF cushioning effect in the same way the brain is.
So what happens to the eyes under high negative G?
They experience the full force of that intense hyperemia. The tiny blood vessels on the surface and potentially within the eye can rupture, leading to temporary blindness, often described subjectively as redoubt.
Redoubt, as opposed to blackout.
Yes. The entire field of vision is perceived as being filled with a red haze, presumably due to the blood accumulating or hemorrhaging in front of the retina.
So positive G causes blackout, negative G can cause readout. Both are obviously bad for flying. Are there ways to protect against these effects, particularly the more immediately incapacitating positive G?
Absolutely. Since positive G is generally considered more dangerous for maintaining consciousness and immediate flight control, significant effort has gone into developing procedures and equipment to counteract its effects.
What can pilots do themselves?
Experienced pilots learn specific physical maneuvers, things like forcefully tightening their abdominal and leg muscles, and sometimes leaning forward slightly.
How does that help?
This muscular contraction helps compress the large veins in the abdomen and legs, reducing the amount of blood that can pool there. It essentially squeezes the blood back upwards towards the heart, helping to maintain venous return and cardiac output, which can delay the onset of blackout by a G or two.
And then there's specialized equipment.
Yes, the most common is the anti-G suit. These are specialized flight suits, essentially trousers, and an abdominal binder that contain inflatable bladders.
How do they work?
They're connected to a valve that senses the G-force. As the positive G increases, the valve automatically inflates these bladders with air pressure.
So the suit squeezes the pilot's legs and abdomen?
Precisely. It applies external counterpressure to the lower body, physically preventing the blood vessels from dilating too much and stopping excessive blood from pooling in the legs and abdomen. This maintains better blood flow to the upper body and brain, significantly increasing a pilot's G tolerance.
By how much?
A good anti-G suit combined with straining maneuvers can add several Gs to a pilot's tolerance, allowing them to withstand maybe 8 or 9 G for short periods without blacking out.
The source also mentions a more theoretical concept for protection: submersion.
Ah, yes, the idea of submerging the pilot in a tank or a suit filled with water. The theory is that the external hydrostatic pressure exerted by the water could potentially balance the internal forces acting on the blood during centrifugal acceleration. If the pressure outside equals the pressure inside, maybe the blood wouldn't shift as much.
Could that work? Would it allow much higher G tolerance?
It's an interesting idea, but the source points out a major flaw. Even if the water pressure balanced the forces on the blood, you still have airflow spaces in the body, most notably the lungs.
And what would happen to them?
Under very high G, the surrounding tissues and organs, like the heart, lungs, and diaphragm, would still be subject to massive displacement forces. The air in the lungs allows them to be compressed or shifted into seriously abnormal positions. So even if this kind of water immersion were technically feasible, the source concludes that the safety limit due to organ displacement would likely still be less than 10 G. It's not a magic bullet.
Okay, let's shift focus from the centrifugal forces common in atmospheric flight to the linear acceleratory forces that are particularly crucial in space travel.
Right. While spacecraft in stable orbit aren't usually subjected to high centrifugal Gs unless something goes wrong and the vehicle starts tumbling or gyrating abnormally.
The major linear forces occur during launch and landing.
Exactly. The sustained, powerful accelerations during blastoff to reach orbital velocity, and the equally intense decelerations during atmospheric reentry and final landing. These are primarily linear forces acting along one axis.
Blastoff acceleration must be immense. The source shows a graph, figure 44-4.
Yes, it illustrates a typical acceleration profile for a multi-stage spacecraft launch, like the Saturn V used for Apollo missions. It shows the astronauts experiencing very high G forces.
How high?
Potentially peaking up to 9G during the first stage burn, and then maybe up to 8G during the second stage burn. And crucially, these aren't just momentary spikes. These high G forces are sustained for several minutes at a time as the spacecraft fights gravity and gains tremendous speed.
Can the human body even withstand that? You said 4-6 positive G causes blackout?
Not in the standard upright positive G plus G orientation, no. The body absolutely could not withstand 8 or 9 G along the head-to-foot axis for minutes. You'd lose consciousness instantly and likely suffer severe injury.
So how do astronauts survive launch?
This is precisely why astronaut seats or couches are designed the way they are. They are semi-reclining and critically oriented transverse to the main axis of acceleration.
Transverse, meaning sideways to the force.
Essentially, yes. The primary acceleration force during launch pushes the astronaut backwards into the couch, applying the G-force across their chest and back, called plus GX acceleration.
And the body tolerates force better in that direction.
Much, much better. In this transverse, semi-reclining position, the body can withstand these high sustained G forces of launch relatively easily without the severe blood pooling and blackout issues associated with positive G along the spine. It's a fundamental piece of spacecraft design derived directly from understanding these human physiological limits.
Okay, so launch acceleration is managed by body position. What about deceleration during reentry, coming back to Earth?
Deceleration, especially from very high orbital or interplanetary velocities, presents enormous challenges. The physics of shedding that incredible kinetic energy are daunting. The source gives a really dramatic comparison to highlight this.
What's the comparison?
It compares the distance needed to decelerate safely, meaning without exceeding human G limits, from different starting speeds. To decelerate from Mach 1, roughly the speed of sound requires a deceleration distance of only about 0.12 miles. Pretty short.
Okay. But what if you're coming back from, say, Mars at much higher speeds? Let's use their extreme example, Mach 100.
To decelerate safely for Mach 100, according to the physics involved, you would theoretically need a continuous deceleration over a distance of about 10,000 miles.
10,000 miles. Just to slow down. Why such a massive difference?
It comes back to that squared term in the energy equation. The total amount of kinetic energy a spacecraft possesses, which has to be dissipated or gotten rid of as heat during deceleration, is proportional to the square of its velocity.
So going from Mach 1 to Mach 100 is a 100-fold increase in speed.
But the kinetic energy you need to shed is 100 squared, which is 10,000 times greater.
10,000 times more energy to dissipate.
Exactly. This means that deceleration from extremely high velocities must be accomplished much, much more slowly, either over a vastly longer distance through gradual atmospheric braking, or over a much longer time period using retro rockets, compared to slowing down from lower velocities. You need that enormous distance or time to bleed off that incredible amount of energy gradually, without subjecting the spacecraft and its occupants to unsurvivable deceleratory G-forces.
That really puts the challenge of high-speed atmospheric entry into perspective.
It certainly does.
Now, deceleration forces also come into play in scenarios much closer to Earth, like parachute jumps. How does the body handle those forces?
Okay, let's walk through a jump. When a parachutist leaves the plane, their initial downward velocity is essentially zero relative to the air. Gravity immediately starts accelerating them downwards.
But air resistance builds up, right?
Yes, as their speed increases, the upward force of air resistance increases proportionally. After about 12 seconds of free fall, the upward drag force equals the downward force of gravity. At this point, the net force is zero and the person stops accelerating. They reach a stable terminal velocity.
How fast is that typically?
The source says it's usually between 109 and 119 miles per hour, which is about 175 feet per second. Pretty fast.
What happens when they open the parachute at that speed? Is there a jolt?
Oh, yes. A massive, sudden decelerating force occurs as the canopy inflates and drastically increases air resistance. This creates what's called the opening shock load on the parachute shrouds and the harness. The source estimates this peak load can be as high as 1,200 pounds.
A big tug.
A very big tug. Once the parachute is fully open and stable, it dramatically slows the rate of descent. A standard parachute typically reduces the fall velocity to about 1/9 of the terminal velocity.
So landing speed is much slower.
Much slower. Landing speed is usually around 20 feet per second.
How does the impact force compare?
Well, since impact force is related to the change in velocity squared, landing at 19th the speed means the force of impact when hitting the ground is roughly 192, or about 181st of what it would be if you hit the ground at terminal velocity without a parachute.
So a huge reduction, obviously.
Right.
But is 20 feet per second still a significant impact?
It is. The source notes it's still considerable, roughly equivalent to the impact force you'd experience if you jumped without a parachute from a height of about 6 feet onto a hard surface, enough to cause injury if not handled correctly.
This is why landing technique is so critical for parachutists and paratroopers.
Absolutely crucial. The source points out the stark difference. If an untrained or unprepared person hits the ground with their legs rigid and extended,
The rapid deceleration force is transmitted straight up through their skeleton,
Right.
like hitting concrete with stiff legs.
exactly. This generates tremendous instantaneous forces along the bone axis, almost certainly resulting in fractures of the pelvis, vertebrae, or leg bones.
But trained jumpers do it differently.
Yes. A trained parachutist learns to strike the earth with their knees and hips bent, but with their muscles taut. This allows their legs and body to act like springs or shock absorbers.
How does that help?
By bending and flexing upon impact, they dissipate the deceleratory force over a slightly longer time and distance, dramatically reducing the peak force experienced by the bones and joints. They effectively cushion the shock, managing the impact forces within the body's structural limits and preventing injury. It's all about controlled energy absorption.
Okay. Fascinating physics and physiology, even in a parachute jump. Now, let's move completely off planet into the environment of space itself, beyond the dynamic forces of launch and re-entry.
Right. Outer space presents a fundamentally different challenge. It has essentially no atmosphere, no pressure, no breathable air, which means living and working there requires creating a completely sealed artificial climate inside the spacecraft or spacesuit.
What are the absolute basic requirements for that artificial atmosphere?
At the most fundamental level, you need two things: a sufficient concentration or partial pressure of oxygen for the crew to breathe, and a low enough concentration of carbon dioxide.
Why is controlling CO2 so important?
Because if the CO2 exhaled by the crew builds up in the sealed environment, it becomes toxic and will eventually cause suffocation, even if there's still plenty of oxygen present. You have to actively remove the CO2.
How has spacecraft atmospheres been designed? Has it changed over time?
Yes, the approach has evolved. The source mentions that some earlier space missions, like the U.S. Mercury and Gemini programs back in the 60s, actually used a pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule.
100% oxygen. Was it at normal pressure?
No, it was at a lower total pressure, typically around 260 millimeter Hg, which is about 1/3 of sea level pressure. This provided a sufficient partial pressure of oxygen, around 260 millimeter HDPO2, while keeping the pressure difference between the inside and outside of the capsule lower, which simplified engineering.
But modern missions don't do that. Why the change?
Modern missions like the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, ISS, and likely future long-duration vehicles typically use a gas mixture much more similar to Earth's air, usually about 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, at a total pressure closer to normal sea level, 760 millimeter Hg.
What are the advantages of using a nitrogen-oxygen mix instead of pure O2?
There are two major advantages highlighted in the text. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, using nitrogen greatly diminishes the risk of fire.
Because pure oxygen environments are extremely flammable.
Extremely. Pure oxygen makes combustion much easier to start and proceed much more rapidly and intensely. The tragic Apollo 1 fire was a stark lesson in the dangers of pure oxygen atmospheres, even at ground level. Adding inert nitrogen significantly reduces this fire hazard.
This makes sense. What's the second advantage?
The second advantage is that having nitrogen present provides protection against a condition called lung atelectasis.
Atelectasis, what's that?
It's the collapse of small regions of lung tissue, like alveoli or small bronchioles.
How does nitrogen prevent that?
The source explains it well. If you're breathing pure oxygen, and a small airway, like a tiny bronchiole, happens to get temporarily blocked by a bit of mucus.
The oxygen trapped in the lung tissue, beyond that blockage, gets absorbed into the blood very quickly because there's a large pressure gradient for it.
Exactly. With no other gas present to hold the space open, as soon as the oxygen is absorbed, the lung tissue downstream of the blockage simply collapses like a deflated balloon.
But if there's nitrogen in the mix,
Nitrogen isn't absorbed into the blood nearly as readily as oxygen. So if a blockage occurs, the nitrogen remains trapped in the alveoli behind the blockage, acting like a stent, keeping the lung tissue inflated and preventing it from collapsing. It provides a sort of gaseous scaffolding.
clever. So mixed gas is safer in multiple ways. But for very long missions, months or years, carrying enough stored oxygen even as part of a mix becomes a huge challenge, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It becomes physically impractical due to the sheer weight and volume of the oxygen tanks required. You simply can't launch that much oxygen for, say, a multi-year Mars mission.
So this necessitates developing ways to recycle the air, regenerate oxygen on board.
Precisely. Long-duration spaceflight depends on reliable life support systems that can recycle oxygen. The source mentions proposed solutions falling into two main categories: physical-chemical methods and biological methods.
What's an example of a physical method?
A common physical-chemical method is the electrolysis of water. You use electricity, presumably generated by solar panels or another power source, to split water molecules, H2O, back into their components: hydrogen gas, H2, and breathable oxygen gas, O2. The oxygen is returned to the cabin air, and the hydrogen might be vented or potentially used for other processes.
And a biological approach?
A biological approach involves harnessing photosynthesis, using organisms like algae or potentially specific types of bacteria that contain chlorophyll.
Like creating a tiny ecosystem on board.
Essentially, yes. These organisms would take in the carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew, use water, and use light energy from lamps or sunlight to perform photosynthesis, converting the CO2 back into organic compounds, biomass, and crucially, releasing fresh oxygen back into the atmosphere for the crew to breathe. It mimics Earth's ecosystem balance.
Have these recycling systems been perfected? Are we ready for Mars in that sense?
Well, the source notes, and this is still largely true, that despite significant research and development over decades, a completely satisfactory, fully closed loop, highly reliable, and efficient system for recycling all the necessary oxygen and managing the entire spacecraft atmosphere long term has not yet been definitively achieved and flight proven for very long durations. It remains a major engineering and biological challenge for enabling extended human missions far from Earth. Partial recycling happens on the ISS, but true closure is hard.
A critical technology gap still to be fully bridged. Now, let's talk about perhaps the most unique and profoundly peculiar physiological state experienced by astronauts in orbit: weightlessness, or more accurately, microgravity.
Yes, microgravity. That's the state of experiencing near-zero G-force, where you and everything around you floats freely inside the spacecraft. It's an environment humans never evolved to experience.
And the source makes an important clarification about what causes it. It's not because there's no gravity in orbit, right?
Absolutely not. That's a common misconception. Gravity from the Earth is still very strong at typical orbital altitudes, like the ISS. It's maybe only 10% less than on the surface. The moon, the sun, other celestial bodies, their gravity is also still active and pulling on the spacecraft and everything inside it.
So why do you feel weightless if gravity is still pulling on you?
The reason you feel weightless is because both the spacecraft and you, the person inside it, are being pulled by Earth's gravity with exactly the same acceleratory force and in the exact same direction. You are essentially in a continuous state of free fall around the Earth.
Like being in an elevator when the cable snaps, but you're falling sideways really fast.
That's a classic analogy, yes. Because there's no relative acceleration between you and the floor or walls of the spacecraft you're all falling together. There's no force pushing you towards any particular surface. Hence, the sensation of weightlessness.
What are the immediate physiological challenges of just being in microgravity? For short periods, say a few days.
For relatively short durations, the source suggests the challenges aren't usually major or life-threatening. The immediate issues tend to fall into three main categories mentioned.
What's the first one?
Motion sickness, space motion sickness, or space adaptation syndrome. It affects a surprisingly large number of astronauts, the text says almost 50%, usually most acutely during the first 2 to 5 days of a mission.
Why does weightlessness cause motion sickness?
It's thought to be caused by conflating sensory information reaching the brain's equilibrium centers, particularly the vestibular system in the inner ear. You're experiencing unfamiliar patterns of acceleration and movement as you float around, but your inner ear, which normally relies heavily on gravity cues to tell your brain which way is down, isn't getting those consistent gravitational signals anymore.
So the eyes, inner ear, and body position sensors are sending mixed messages.
Exactly. This sensory mismatch, this conflict between what the different systems are reporting, makes many people feel quite nauseated and disoriented until their brain adapts over a few days.
Okay, motion sickness is one. What's the second immediate effect?
The second is the translocation or shifting of body fluids. On Earth, gravity naturally pulls fluids slightly downwards, creating hydrostatic pressure gradients, higher pressure in your feet than your head when standing.
But in microgravity?
That gravitational pull is effectively gone. So fluids are no longer pooled slightly in the lower extremities. Instead, they redistribute upwards towards the head, chest, and upper body.
Is this noticeable?
Very much so. Astronauts often develop a characteristic puffy face and sometimes sinus congestion, referred to as fat face, along with noticeably thinner legs, sometimes called bird legs. This upward fluid shift also tricks the body's volume sensors into thinking there's too much fluid overall, which signals the kidneys to excrete more fluid, leading to a fairly rapid decrease in total blood volume in the first few days.
Interesting. And the third immediate consequence mentioned?
The third is simply the consequence of dramatically diminished physical activity, or at least diminished effort. On Earth, your muscles are constantly working against gravity just to keep you upright, to walk, to lift things.
But in space, you don't need muscle strength for that.
Not in the same way. You can push off a wall with just a fingertip and glide effortlessly across the cabin. Activities that require significant muscle force on Earth need very little effort in microgravity. This lack of constant gravitational loading on the muscles and bones is a key factor leading to longer-term problems.
Okay, so those are the immediate effects. But what happens during prolonged stays in weightlessness? Weeks, months, maybe even years.
This is where the more serious physiological concerns arise. The observed effects of prolonged exposure to microgravity become much more significant and, concerningly, are very similar in many ways to the effects of prolonged, strict bed rest here on Earth. It's essentially an extreme form of unloading the body.
What are the main effects listed?
The source lists several key ones: a sustained decrease in overall blood volume, continuing beyond the initial fluid shift, a decrease in total red blood cell mass, space anemia, a significant reduction in muscle strength and overall work capacity, a decrease in the heart's maximum pumping capacity, maximum cardiac output.
And perhaps the most worrying one.
Yes, arguably the most concerning for very long missions is a continuous loss of calcium and phosphate from the bones. This leads to a measurable loss of bone mineral density and weakening of the bone structure, essentially, space-induced osteoporosis.
Why does bone loss happen?
Bones, like muscles, remodel based on the mechanical stress placed upon them. Without the constant loading force of gravity, the normal balance between bone formation and bone resorption shifts. Bone breakdown starts to outpace bone building, leading to net bone loss, particularly in weight-bearing bones like the legs, hips, and spine.
Are these effects reversible?
Many are, but recovery can take time after returning to Earth. And the longer the mission, the more profound the deconditioning, and potentially the longer and less complete the recovery.
This is why astronauts on the ISS spend so much time exercising.
Absolutely. Rigorous daily exercise programs are absolutely essential countermeasures for astronauts on long-duration space missions. They typically involve treadmills with bungee cords to simulate weight, stationary bicycles, and specialized resistance exercise devices designed to provide mechanical loading to the muscles and bones.
Does the exercise completely prevent these problems?
It helps significantly mitigate them, but unfortunately, even with several hours of dedicated exercise per day, it doesn't seem to completely prevent all the deconditioning effects, especially the bone loss on very long flights.
What happens when astronauts return to Earth after a long mission?
Even with the exercise programs, especially noted in astronauts from earlier missions or perhaps those with less vigorous protocols, they often exhibited severely decreased work capacities for the first few days or even weeks back in Earth's gravity.
And that dizziness issue.
Yes, they commonly experience orthostatic intolerance. That's the tendency to feel dizzy, lightheaded, or even faint when they try to stand up after being horizontal or in microgravity for a long time.
Why does that happen?
It's due to a combination of factors caused by the spaceflight deconditioning. The diminished overall blood volume means there's less fluid to circulate, and importantly, the impairment of the arterial baroreceptor reflexes. Those pressure sensors we talked about with G-forces become less responsive after prolonged unloading.
So the body doesn't react quickly enough when they stand up.
Right. The reflexes don't trigger the necessary rapid heart rate increase and blood vessel constriction in the legs quickly or strongly enough to prevent blood from pooling downwards due to gravity, leading to a temporary drop in blood pressure to the brain, causing the dizziness or fainting. This orthostatic intolerance still occurs to some extent even with modern countermeasures.
The source uses the term deconditioning to describe these long-term effects.
Yes, cardiovascular, muscle, and bone deconditioning. It emphasizes that during very long flights, even with the best current exercise regimens, there seems to be a gradual worsening of these issues.
How bad can the bone loss get?
The text mentions rates as high as 1.0% of total bone mass being lost per month on multi-month flights, even with exercise. That's a huge amount. And if it continues linearly, it raises serious concerns about fracture risk on, say, a 3-year Mars mission.
And the muscles.
There's also substantial atrophy, a wasting away or shrinking, observed in both skeletal muscles throughout the body and, significantly, in the heart muscle, cardiac muscle itself. The heart doesn't have to work as hard in space, so it tends to weaken.
So the cardiovascular deconditioning involves the heart muscle itself, plus the blood volume and reflexes.
Correct. Decreased work capacity, reduced blood volume, impaired baroreceptor reflexes, reduced orthostatic tolerance. It's a whole package of cardiovascular deconditioning.
And the impact upon returning to a gravity field, like landing on Mars or back on Earth.
It could greatly limit an astronaut's ability to perform even basic tasks requiring standing upright, walking, or physical effort, especially immediately after landing when they might need to be self-sufficient or handle an emergency.
The source highlights this as a critical issue for future Mars missions.
Absolutely. The prolonged period of microgravity during the 6- and 9-month transit each way could potentially leave astronauts severely debilitated upon arrival on the Martian surface, which has about 38% of Earth's gravity, or upon return to Earth. It poses a very serious operational threat.
So if exercise alone isn't the complete answer,
then significant research and development efforts are focused on finding other, more effective countermeasures, or perhaps ways to make exercise more effective.
what's one promising alternative or supplement mentioned?
One countermeasure that's been investigated and tested, including on the ISS, is the application of intermittent artificial gravity.
Artificial gravity,
Yeah.
like spinning the
Well,
spaceship.
not necessarily the whole ship, which presents huge engineering challenges. A more practical approach being tested involves having astronauts spend some time each day, maybe an hour or so, strapped into specially designed short-arm centrifuges located inside the spacecraft.
So they sit in a chair that spins them around.
Essentially, yes. The spinning motion creates a centrifugal acceleration, similar to the g-forces in an aircraft turn. This exposes their bodies to artificial g-forces, perhaps equivalent to 1g or even 2 or 3g, pressing them into their seat.
What's the goal of doing that?
The idea, the hope, is that these brief daily periods of experiencing mechanical load and hydrostatic pressure gradients, even if artificial, could provide the necessary physiological stimulus to their bones, muscles, and cardiovascular system to prevent, or at least significantly slow down, the debilitating deconditioning process caused by continuous microgravity. It's an active area of research.
Wow. We have really journeyed through an incredible spectrum of physiological extremes today, haven't we?
We certainly have, from the fundamental physics of pressure drops at high altitude, navigating the complex world of low oxygen.
And the body's really ingenious multi-layered process of acclimatization, orchestrated by those master switches like HIFs.
Culminating in the truly remarkable capabilities of native Highlanders, adapted over generations.
And then we confronted the acute dangers of pushing too fast mountain sickness and the chronic toll of staying too long at extreme altitude, like chronic mountain sickness.
Then we plunged into the intense, sometimes violent effects of acceleratory forces in aviation and space travel, positive G, negative G, launch, re-entry.
And finally, explore the very peculiar and ultimately quite debilitating reality of near-zero G, weightlessness in orbit.
It's a story that powerfully demonstrates both the extraordinary capacity of the human body to adapt to environmental stressors
And its inherent, sometimes stark limitations when those stressors become too extreme, too prolonged, or too unnatural.
We saw how the body literally remodels itself, increasing ventilation, boosting red blood cells, enhancing lung capacity, growing new blood vessels, tweaking cellular machinery, all in response to the challenge of low oxygen at altitude. It's a testament to our deep evolutionary heritage.
But we also saw clearly where those adaptations aren't enough, or can even turn harmful, the point where low oxygen leads to coma and death, where G-forces cause blackout and bone fracture, where chronic altitude exposure triggers heart failure, and where the simple absence of gravity leads to significant wasting of muscle and bone.
Understanding these extreme pressures isn't just academic or just for pilots, climbers, and astronauts. It fundamentally helps all of us appreciate the intricate, delicate balance that keeps our own bodies functioning optimally, even in our everyday environment at sea level.
And it really underscores the sheer ingenuity and complexity required to engineer the life support systems and countermeasures that can replicate the conditions necessary for human survival and function beyond Earth's protective atmosphere. It boils down to the absolute fundamental requirements of human physiology, put to the ultimate test.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering that incredible deep biological drive to adapt to environmental stressors like low oxygen, which is so profoundly evident in acclimatization and especially in the unique physiology of high altitude natives, what might the long-term multi-generational effects of human populations eventually living off Earth, perhaps in large rotating habitats with artificial gravity, or on planetary surfaces like Mars with partial gravity and altered atmospheres, what might that mean for the future trajectory of human physiology and perhaps even over millennia, human evolution?
Or maybe bringing it back closer to home.
Yeah.
How does studying the ways systems break down under these extreme stresses, like the heart failure and chronic mountain sickness, or the bone loss and cardiovascular deconditioning in space, how does that provide crucial insights that could help us better understand and maybe treat related conditions like congestive heart failure, osteoporosis, or even the effects of prolonged bed rest right here on Earth?
There are undoubtedly profound connections and potential benefits waiting to be fully explored by continuing to study how the human body responds when pushed to its absolute limits.